On the top of Lamites Hamid Beis, we continue with the kasha that Rava raises against Rav Nachman based on the Mishnah in the Nedarim. Hareatol like cherem. So Reuven says that Shimon should be to him, to Reuven, as a cherem. He's not allowed to have any hano from him. Hano der also. Reuven now has prohibited himself from getting any benefit from Shimon. If, on the other hand, he says, Hareini will add the word cherem, olecha, v'ata alai, so it should go in both directions, and Shneim Asurim zebozeh. Reuven cannot have hana from Shimon because he prohibited himself from doing so, and he also imposed an Isur hana on Shimon from his possessions. So it now becomes a two-way Isur. Umutar b'shel ole bava. Nevertheless, they are permitted to have hana from the Ole Bavel. We'll see in the Gemara what this means. Yasurim b'shal osa ha'ir. But those things that belong to the Anshe ha'ir in which they live, that local city, that they are prohibited. And the reason is because all the Bnei ha'ir are shutfim. And each one could prohibit, as a result of his ownership, someone else from getting benefit from. Therefore, also kol echad mehem, each of these two people are enjoined from having hana because of the chelik of chavero. However, with regard to Oli Bavel, that which belonged to the Oli Bavel, we don't say that each member of Klal Yisrael has a chelik, he's a shutav, but rather, mitchila, when the Ole Bavel designated whatever they designated in the case of a cistern mayim for anyone who comes on Aliyah L'Regel, they were mafkirid for all Klal Yisrael. They didn't give any particular Jew a shutfis, a partnership in the mayim. And amongst the various things that belong to the Oli Bavel, we have now an enumerated list. Eluheim Dvarim Shel Oli Bavel, Harabayas, Halashakos, Va'azaros. These are various parts of the Beis HaMikdash. Ubar, and a cistern of water, Shal Emtzai Derech, which is dug in the middle of the road. Eluheim. Now we go to the other category of Shal Osa Ir, in which case each member of the city has the authority to be to Oser al Bnei Ha'ir, Harachov. That's where they used to take the teva out into the public area. Ubeis HaKnesses, that's also designated for the entire city. Ubeis HaMerchatz, and the public bathhouses. Now Rava comes back based on this Mishnah in Nedarim to raise his objection to Rav Nachman. As we discussed earlier, Rav Nachman is of the opinion that the bira, the bar of Mayim, of the Oli Bavel, belongs to Shutfim, and everybody has his Shutfis in it, is a Mayim Mutter. Why is it that the Mishnah establishes that each one could have Hana from the bar of Oli Bavel? But tonight we have a Mishnah, again in Masechet Nedarim on Daf Mem Hamid Beis, Hashutfim Shenadru Hana Zemizeh. If they prohibited Hana reciprocally one on the other, Asur Likanis Lechatzeh, they're not allowed to enter into the courtyard one of the other, because then they'd be benefiting from that which their friend owns, his chelik. And from the fact that this Mishnah, when it lists those things that are mutter lehenos, they have here on the list of bar shel Oli Bavel, we have no choice but to conclude that this bar is not considered like a bar shel shutfim, because then it would be asurim. They would be prohibited from benefiting from the mayim, but rather the bar is considered a bar of hefker. And this is a head-on collision with Rav Nachman's shita that the bar is considered a bar shel shutfim. And the Gemara answers, lirchot bar, if you want to go into the bar itself and wash yourself and bathe, hachinami, that would be awesome, because of the halacha that we established based on this principle in Nedarim, that shutfim shenodru ano zem miseh asurim, they can generate an iser osrim lahenos mimamin shalashutfim. Each one is considered a bailim and therefore has the authority to generate an iser neder on his friend. But v'hachem b'mayas kinon, in the case in the mission in the Dharma, which was matir, for the noder and the mudar to have hanof and the bar shall only novel. What was the case? Lemalos, they weren't going into the bar to bathe themselves, but rather they were going to draw water from the bar. And in that case, mar mididei kamamale, umar mididei kamamale. We have here a chalukas hashutfim, defending the shita of Rav Nachman that bar shal oli bavel is a shutfis. However, there's what's called a chalukas hashutfis. Each one is taking his designated part of this bar. He's being mamale, he's filling up his pail with the water that's really his. And that means that once he picks up that water, that volume of water, he designates it for himself lima freya retroactively. It's now a biur, a clarification that this was his chelik in the bar. So therefore, each person, when he draws water from the bar, whether it's Ruven or Shimon, is benefiting from his own mayan. Now, this is based on the principle of Brera, of Yesh Brera. And the Gemara is now asking, how can you defend Rav Nachman with your interpretation that the reason for the heter anov in the bar in the case of Oli Bavel is because we rely on the halacha of Brera. Rav Nachman himself rejects the halacha of Brera. He holds ein Brera. And that's what the Gemara is going to prove now from the Mishnah in Shkolim. So let's mention two introductions, the background that we need for the Mishnah in Shkolim. First of all, there's a concept called a kalbon. And the word kalbon is a mixture of two words, kal bein. Dover kal umuat shemosifim al machtis hashekel. The Torah commands us in Parshas Kitisa, Os Perek Lamed, Hashir lo yarpev hatal lo yamit mimachtis hashekel loses es trumas Hashem l'chaper al nafsho seichem. And this is the truma, the contribution, which is obligatory annually called a machtis hashekel, money that will be designated for karbonos sibra, as the pasuk says, l'chaper al nafsho seichem. Now, what's going to happen is that when the people come to bring their machzis hashekel to the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim, to the Trumas Halishka, what they want to do is they want to go to a money changer. And what's the point of going to a money changer? He says the following, that chatzoi shkolim are very, very thin. It's very easy to lose them. And therefore, what the Gizbar would do is they would go with the money, the Masechet shekel, to the money changer to be machlif the money to larger coins. And that would make it easier to travel and relocate these coins to Yerushalayim without losing them. And what happens is when you exchange money, you pay a commission to the money changer. So in order to offset that loss of Hegdesh, then instead of getting the full Machzah shekel, they'll get a minus because they have to pay off the money changer. The Chachamim established a takana that every Torah, every contributor should add a little bit of amount of money, which is called a ma'a ktana, otherwise known as the kalmon. And that's what he should add to offset the loss of Hegdesh by having to exchange the money from a chalfan, from a money changer. Now, if two people join together and they set and designate a full shekel for both of them, half a shekel for each one. Then they have to give 2 pelbonos. But if a father does, on behalf of his son, a machzis hashekel, then he doesn't have to give, let's say he's giving 1 full shekel, half for himself and half for his son. He doesn't have to give 2 kalbonim. 1 kalbon is sufficient. And now he's potter from the second kalbon, and he only brings and pays 1 extra kalbon to add to the machzis hashekel. That's introduction number 1. Now we go on to another halacha called Maser Behema. The Torah requires that on an annual basis, we take off 1/10 of bakar and tzon that were born on that year. We count them out in a million, 1, 2, 3, and the 10th, Asireh, is Kodesh Lashem. And that's the Kedusha of Maser Behema. And we bring the Maser Behema up to Yerushalayim, and we eat it there after we were makriv the chelev and the dam on the mizbeach. Now the Beitza in Masechet Bechoros on Daf Nun Vav Amud Beis darshins that the mitzvah of Maser Behema only applies when there's private ownership and Adam Yachid owns the Behema. But if you have an entire Eder of Shutvim, the Shutvim are potter from Maser Behema. So the Gemara now tries to prove that Rav Nachman holds Ein Breira. V'chsava Rav Nachman Yesh Breira v'Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah Shkolim, Ha'achim she'hashutvim, when a person dies, the father dies, then his sons become Shutvim. And they agreed to divide up the Yerusha as a chalukas Shutvim, just like 2 partners who separate their partnership, they break it up, each one gets his portion. So too, each of the Achim in the Yerusha, the estate of their father, will get his portion, and they'll be Shutvim. Now, there is a situation in which, with regard to Yerusha, it's considered Mammon Shel Shnayim, and therefore it's like Mammon HaShutvim. And there are other situations in which it's considered Mammon Shel Yachid, which means it's as if the father is still alive. And that's called Tfusas Habayis, which we'll explain as we go along. Kishechayavim b'kolbon, p'turim v'maser behema. Ukshechayavim b'maser behema, p'turim min ha'kalbon. There's an inverse relationship between kalbon and maser sheni. Let's go through the cases. If they're chayav in a kalbon, it means that from the get-go, they divided up the Yerusha, and then they joined together in a shutfis. Their status is that of shutvim, regular classic shutvim, partners, and even if they joined together to give 1 shekel between the 2 of them, each one is chayav his own kalbon. However, in such a case, since we classify them after they divided the Yerusha and they went back to becoming Shutvim, as P'turim Maser Behema, Shutvim, as we said earlier, are exempt from Maser Behema. Maser Behema only applies to a Behema of an Adam Yachid, of 1 individual. Now we have the reverse situation. When they did not divide it amongst them from the get-go, Mitchila, as Yerusha Saviyah, but rather they immediately agreed that we will continue the status of the estate without divvying it up to private ownership amongst the brothers. It's as if they initially, from the get-go, had a shutfis, and this din of continuing and extending the status of the estate without dividing it up is called tfusas habayis, which means that we view the estate as if it's still in the possession of the father. He's the late father, he's already gone, but imagining as if he were alive. And in this case, where there was no chalukah, and then subsequently they created a shutfis, But from the get-go, they created a shutvis, meaning they were ma'asher, they certified the original tfusas habayis. It's chayavim v'maser behema. Now there'll be a chiyuv v'maser behema as if the father were alive. There's no joint ownership here. There's no shutvis. It's a behema shel hayachid. And pturim min hakalbon. And the father is now giving a machzis hashekel on behalf of each one of his sons. And as we said earlier, in that case, they don't need two kalbonim. One kalbon will do. Amar Rav Hanan in embellishing this Mishnah writes that Lo Shanu, when they divide it up, and we said they break up the Yerusha, and there's no longer din of Tfus Habayis Ella, that only applies in the following scenario. Shechalku Gidayim Keneged Tloim, Utloim Keneged Gidayim. It means that each one took a different min from the Yerusha. One took Gidayim and the other took Tloim. Now we know that a Gedi and a Tleh have different values in the market, so this would not be a fair chalukah. They must have evaluated, based on market conditions, what the Gedi is worth and what the Tleh is worth. And then they divided it up. You take a Gedi or two Gedis, I'll take one Tleh, or vice versa. And that's called Achim Shehiknu Zelis. Each one is transferring ownership to the other one. And now when they go back and become Shutfim, their status is equivalent, is identical with the status of all Shutfim who buy something from the market and they buy it in a joint ownership. Avol, says Rav Hanan, Cholku Gidoyim Keneged Gidoyim Utloim Keneged Tloim. In other words, they divided up Lefi Kefi Mishpat HaYerusha, and the Mishpat HaYerusha is that each one gets a portion of every single species, every single min. And in this case, we're going to apply the law of Breira. And Ani Omer, I'm going to say that each chelek that he receives, each one respectively, Zeh Chelka Magio Mishar Rishon Lekach. It's his chelek from the get-go. Retroactively, that is his portion in the estate. And therefore, even after the chalukah, they remain Yorshim. So that when they were chosev and ishtatfu, that's not stam shutfis. What they're doing is as we said earlier, they're affirming and extending the original Yerusha state. And that's a tfusas habayis. Therefore, the chayav in maser behema, because the father now has to give maser behema, there's no shutfis here, but p'turim min hakalbon, because the father, when he gives a matzah shekel on behalf of his son, there's no additional payment of a kalbon. And now we get to Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman Omar afilu cholku gidoyim keneged gidoyim utloim keneged tloim ein omer zeh chelko magio mishar rishon lekach. Even though they divided the animals one against another one in the same bin, and you would say that in such a case, that's called tfusas habayis. They're just reaffirming the original Yerusha state. No. Says Rav Nachman, even in this case, we're going to consider when they divide it up that it works only mikanu lahaba. Now Reuven got his gedi, Shimon got his, and then when they join together as shutfim, they become regular shutfim, not shutfim of tfusas habayis, but rather stam shutfim. And we see, therefore, the Rav Nachman is not operating with the din of Breira. He's not willing to say that when each one gets his chelek, Reuven and Shimon in this Yerusha, that Igloy Milsil Mafreya, that this was part of their tfusas habayis. No. This is a brand new shutfis, mikanu lahaba, and therefore they're potum maser and they're chayiv and kalbon. So therefore, we're now stuck with the following contradiction. How can we reconcile the fact that according to Rav Nachman, we said before that in the case of a neder, when shutfin took a neder, one asked the other one, they're allowed to be mamala mayim in a bar because the mayim of the bar is considered mayim shel shutfin. And that's predicated on the operation of the rule of Brera, when Rav Nachman here, in the case of Chalukas HaYerusha, denies the din of Brera, rejects it. Ella, says the Gemara, Dekuli Alma Bira Defkera. But now I'm going to rewrite our position and reinterpret it. It must be that not only Rav Sheshes, but even Rav Nachman agrees that the bar of Ole Bavel is a bar shel hefker. And if it's a bar shel hefker, then we're not operating with the din of Brera. We have a din of hefker, and each one who is konim in a hefker he's the bailim, and therefore the tchum will be determined by his bailis. If that be the case, then we have to ask the following question: what is then the machlokes between Rav Sheshes and Rav Nachman, which we had earlier on Lamed Tes Amud Aleph? Because there we came to the conclusion that according to Rav Nachman, it's kiragle mishin ismalulo, and we're not basing it on the premise that bira is a bira shutfim, and therefore we want to know, why is it kiragle mishin ismalulo? When, let's say, Ruvain fills up the water, the pail of water, on behalf of Shimon, Rav Nachman insists that the tchum is going to be determined by Shimon. Kiragle mishin ismalu lo. He was zoche in the mayim. Rav Sheshes says no. It's kiragle abamale. It's Ruvain who actually drew the water up from the bar, and even though he did so on behalf of Shimon, nevertheless Rav Sheshes insists that it's kiragle hamamale, that the tchum for this mayim is determined by Ruvain, who was the mamale. Says the Gemara, machlokes Rav Shimon, Rabbi Sheshes, and Rav Nachman depends upon the sugya of Metzia Daf Yud of Magbia Metzia Lechavero, and whether or not Kana Chavero or Lo Kana Chavero. Can Ruvain be mizake, the mayim in this case, on behalf of Shimon? Now this, by doing so, he's being mafsid others who also would have had a shot at this hefker. They could have possibly been zochim the hefker. And therefore, we talk about what's called magbia. The magbia is defined as tofes of alchov b'makom shechav lacher. There's no such thing as a zechia, which is chav lacher. Like, for example, if Ruvain owes chovos, he has debts, outstanding debts to many people, and we have to collect those debts from his property, from his shibud, from his karka. We don't say that someone could go ahead and take from his karka on behalf of one of the bali chovo, one of the creditors, because that would be to the hefsei, to the loss of another creditor who also has a right to collect that karka. And therefore, we don't apply the din of schia b'makom shechav lacher. And here we have a machlokes between Rav Sheshes and Rav Nachman. Mar Savar, according to Rav Sheshes, what's the deal in Magbia Metzia Lechaver Lo Kana? It means that when Ruvain picks up the hefker on behalf of Shimon, Shimon is not Kohen. However, the Magbia, meaning Ruvain, he himself is Kohen the Metzia. And therefore here the bar of Ole Rogel, which is hefker, according to everybody, when Ruvain fills up the mayim on behalf of Shimon, Shimon is not Kohen, but yet the mamale, who's the magbia in the case of the sugya in Bab Metzia, is zochel yatzim. And therefore the din of the mayim, the status of what is kiragli mamali. Marsav, but Rav Nachman disagrees. He holds that magbia Metzia chaver lo kana, meaning even liatzim. There's no kinyan agba at all that's valid, because the agba was not implemented with the intention of Ruvain collecting and acquiring ownership for himself. and therefore the mayim is still hefker until it will come into the hands of Mishin Ismalulo, the Uz, and then Konam b'Mashicha. Then it could be Kona with a Kinyan Mashicha. The din of the mayim, therefore, is the din of Mishin Ismalulo. And Mishin Ismalulo means until it comes into the hands of Shimon. So Ruvain was Magbia the Mayim, which according to everyone, and we're now focused on Rav Nachman, is Hefker. Ruvain picks up the Hefker on behalf of Shimon. Shimon is not Kona. And Ruvain, according to Rav Nachman, is not Kona for himself, on behalf of himself. Tagba is completely meaningless as a Kinyan. So now we have to wait until Ruvain takes the water in the pail and actually physically transmits it. He gives it over to the hands of Shimon. Transfers it into the hands of Shimon. When it comes into the hands of Shimon, then and only then is Shimon Koneh, and that's called the Mishin Ismalulo, and the Tchum of that Mayim is equal to the Tchum of Shimon. And this leads us to the Mishnah on the bottom of Lamed Tes Omid Beis, and we'll go on in Beitza Shem to Daf Men. Thank you.